So, I guess the topic of today's year on the plains is hay. And this video is going to be a little bit lacking visually. You're mostly just going to have to look at the big empty in front of me because we've already went and got the hay. There was too much work and too much going on to be playing with making YouTubes, and that's how it is sometimes. You know, I'm taking videos, you know, as a secondary thing. You've got to really do the job. So you didn't get to see the hay being loaded since I was loading it. What we did, but it's kind of an interesting question. So the question would be, where does hay come from? How does hay work out here? And the answer is that hay predominantly is grown in irrigated settings. So where we just were was we were up somewhat by the Rocky Mountains, up by the Rocky Mountain front, and those mountains, streams come down from them. There's snowpack up there. Considerable amount of water comes. So in the west, your hay and other irrigated crops in this part of the west is typically grown in areas which are adjacent to the mountains, and they have gravity flow irrigation water. It's not pumping an aquifer like a lot of people think. It actually flows down in this region by gravity from the mountains through a network of irrigation canals, and that's a very, very ancient practice. The Spanish kind of pioneered it with the acequia, they call it, and that actually was a practice that was brought from old Spain, and its original roots are actually in the Middle East. So it's kind of interesting, when the first settlers, the first Anglo settlers from the east came out in this direction, they crossed the plains and the empty frontier. But what's kind of peculiar is that on the west side of the Oregon Trail and the homesteading and the pioneering, when they got far enough west, approaching the southern Rockies, by no means was the land unpopulated. There were villages, there were towns, there were irrigation systems, and largely the Anglo settlers were entirely unfamiliar with the practice of irrigation, but of course they learned very quickly. And that's really the roots of the irrigated farming. So today it's been developed and improved, and you've got now pivot irrigation, which supplements the old canal irrigation. But anyway, most of your hay, with limited exceptions, is going to come from areas adjacent to the mountains where it's grown with that mountain water, and it has to be trucked, not an unreasonable distance thankfully, but trucked back east and south away from the Rockies, down onto these plains for winter feed. So we had a pretty strenuous morning. There were some other people there, but I loaded, or helped load, 260 bales of mixed alfalfa hay, and we split that between 3 different trailers. I do have a load of hay behind me, but the other 2 trucks and trailers were more heavy-duty rigs. They were diesel pickups with larger trailers, so I actually only have 30 bales behind my little vehicle here, and we put over 100 on each of the other vehicles which are riding behind me. But anyway, that's pretty much how it's done. There's a limited amount of hay that is cut, called dryland hay, from rainfall, but that gets tenuous out this far west. So the rain-fed hay is more to the east, and to the west of me you get the irrigated mountain hay, and right where I am, kind of on the farthest west extent of the plains, there's very limited local hay production, and most of the people that still produce hay feed it themselves and don't really sell it as a commercial product. So that's pretty much the deal on hay. I mean, the truck and the trailer is a big deal in this part of the world, because a lot of the time you've got to be moving material. You know, in this case it's about 60 miles one way, which is the lower end of typically what you have to do. So it's kind of an interesting thing to think about. I'm not shying away in this series from showing, you know, how much stuff we do that is dependent on gasoline and diesel. And that's the reality, and it would be a very, very different life out here if there was to ever to be, you know, serious shortfalls of gasoline or diesel. It would have to be, stocking densities would have to be greatly reduced on the ranches, because if you were strictly relying on the feed that was there, you know, you couldn't carry the same number of livestock through the winter, you know, that people are in the habit of carrying. So I guess that's about it. Just showing just part of the lifestyle of you know, hauling hay. And I got a real good deal on this hay because I just have a few animals, but you know, my neighbors that I do some work for have a lot more animals. So just by coming with them, and you know, me thankfully being relatively younger and physically fit, you know, I was able to get my hay at a price that is considerably better than what you would typically experience if you were only buying a small quantity or buying retail hay. We went directly to the irrigated farm there by the mountains, and we loaded it and picked it up from the stack. And what we're moving is small square bales, about 65-pound bales of mixed alfalfa. And that's another interesting trade-off. A lot of the bigger operations, of course, they're using large round bales, or out in this part of the country, it's become much more common to have large square bales, either 3 by 4 by 8 feet long, which is in the neighborhood of 1,200 pounds, or 4 by 4 by 8 feet long, which in that is essentially a ton, a 2,000-pound bale. The downfall of all that is when you get home with a load of 1,000 to 2,000 pound bales, well, you need a tractor with hydraulics to move the hay around. So, you know, if your operation is big enough to justify that, perhaps you could say that that was more economical. But at the same time, there's really still a place for those small bales, because you can feed them strictly by hand out of the back of a pickup truck, and they're pretty essential for operations where there's not enough cattle, you know, herds of 50 or 60 cattle. It doesn't really justify going and buying a $35,000 tractor to move hay around. It's more favorable to pay me to move hay around. So kind of a old school, reminds me of my days of my youth, you know, with my grandfather doing small bale hay. Some people call them idiot cubes. You know, and I'm pretty tired after loading them, so that's kind of why people laugh at them. And they're definitely something for the age of the strong back and the weak mind. And you don't see them quite as much anymore, but there's still a real place for them, and we're real excited to have gotten the load.